Hello there, folks. Today I'm going to tell you a gripping tale of resilience, heartbreak, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Enjoy the story. Natalie! Natalie! Little Peter's ear-piercing shrieks echoed through the dingy halls of St. Maria's Orphanage. The 5-year-old thrashed wildly as the strange couple in cheap polyester suits wrenched him into their beat-up sedan. Peter reached out desperately for his 16-year-old sister Natalie, his tiny hands grasping at the air as fat tears rolled down his reddened cheeks. "Don't let them take me. You promised." "Give him back, you monsters!" Natalie screamed, fighting against the iron grip of Mrs. Wilson, the cruel caretaker with "Soldent Careless" etched into every crevice of her leathery face. The burly woman's meaty, nicotine-stained hands dug into Natalie's slender arms until they were sure to leave bruises as the girl thrashed. "Shut your trap, you little bitch!" Mrs. Wilson snarled, her rancid coffee breath hot on Natalie's face. The sour-faced woman accompanying the man slapped Peter hard across his cherubic face. "Keep howling and you'll get worse," she hissed, as a red welt instantly bloomed on his cheek. Natalie's heart shattered as the grizzled man in the ill-fitting suit finally shoved her baby brother's tiny form into the back seat and slammed the rusted door. She broke free from Mrs. Wilson's grasp for a fleeting moment, running and clinging to the rear door handle as the junker car started moving. "Peter, Peter, I'll find you, I promise. I won't stop looking," she sobbed hysterically, her feet leaving the ground as the vehicle picked up speed. The man reached his scrawny arm out the window and delivered a brutal backhand to the side of Natalie's head. Dazed, with stars clouding her vision, she lost her grip and fell away from the car, her skull cracking sickeningly against the cracked pavement. Natalie and Peter had ended up at the underfunded St. Maria's after a raging house fire claimed their parents' lives just 6 months earlier. Natalie had begged Mr. Johnson, the cold-hearted alcoholic director, to keep them together no matter what. He had promised, as long as she remained calm and obedient. Now his vile lie was laid bare. 4 long days later, the once vibrant, effervescent 16-year-old Natalie was a hollow shell of her former self. She refused all food and drink, lying unmoving in her soiled cot, her haunted eyes unable to comprehend Peter's sudden, inexplicable absence. When the staff tried to force protein shakes and nutrient sludge through her cracked, bleeding lips, Natalie simply went limp. Her empty gaze was fixed on some distant horror only she could see, her matted hair hanging lankly in her face as she zoned out. Finally, after she stopped responding to anyone or anything, the nurses pulled her up by her bony arms to strap her into a rigid chair, and she immediately went unconscious. Natalie's head lolled as she blacked out from the combined effects of dehydration, starvation, and her overwhelming depression. An ambulance rushed the comatose girl to county hospital. She remained catatonic, trapped in a waking nightmare as her skeletal body was hooked up to IVs to keep her alive against her will. Thick, syrupy nutrient fluid was pumped into her veins to bring her back from the brink. After 3 torturous weeks, the overworked doctors at County had done all they could for Natalie's shattered physical condition. But her once brilliant mind was lost in a miasma of depression and trauma. She hadn't uttered a single word since Peter's forced removal. With no other options, the cold bureaucrats running the state's child welfare system transferred the mute, listless girl to St. Elizabeth's Home for Troubled Children. It was little more than a dumping ground for unwanted orphans, run like a makeshift insane asylum. Natalie obsessively wrote page after page in a tattered notebook, desperately trying to make someone at the nightmarish St. Elizabeth's understand what had happened to Peter. She described the strange couple, the sickening way they had treated her little brother, her frantic pleas to the orphanage staff, all to no avail. The overworked, underpaid counselors just shook their heads at Natalie's cryptic writings and ravings about conspiracies. Her unkempt appearance and increasingly erratic behavior, fueled by lack of sleep and proper nutrition, saw her bounced to the psychiatric ward at St. Dymphna's Asylum within a year. If Natalie thought the orphanage was a fresh hell, St. Dymphna's proved to be purgatory itself. The crumbling, mid-19th century brick compound was freezing in winter and stiflingly hot in summer. Dingy, narrow hallways connected cramped day rooms where dozens of unstable souls were left to languish unattended for hours on end. The teenage girl's 11-month descent into madness lasted. She attacked staff with brutally kicked shins and savage hair-pulling, smashed windows with her bare fists until her knuckles were shredded and bleeding, did whatever it took to try and make someone listen to her silent screams for help. All she wanted was answers about what happened to Peter. The hulking male orderly's response was always the same: brutal baton strikes, injections that left her limbs feeling like lead, hours upon hours in solitary confinement. Their harsh discipline only fueled Natalie's wild-eyed mania. She existed in a perpetual state of fear and desperation. Only elderly nurse Betty, a plump, bespectacled woman with a shining aura of kindness, saw the pain buried beneath Natalie's destructive acts. The kind woman took the terrified teenage girl under her wing, teaching her coping techniques and how to properly communicate her needs through writing in a composition notebook Betty provided. For 3 long years after being released from St. Dymphna's at age 19, Natalie worked a string of menial jobs: waitressing at Greasy Spoons, clerk at seedy convenience stores, even a brief stint as a day laborer at a fish processing plant. She penned heartbreaking letters about her plight to churches, legal aid societies, anyone and everyone who would listen, hoping to find someone who could help locate Peter. Natalie bounced between shelters, flop houses, and run-down weekly motels, never staying anywhere long. She remained utterly consumed by her search for her beloved little brother, his cherubic face and infectious giggles never leaving her thoughts. At last, the Boston Legal Assistance Society took pity on the determined young woman's tragic story. After reviewing the reams of documentation she had compiled about Peter's kidnapping, they helped Natalie secure a tiny, run-down studio apartment through a housing program for disadvantaged youths. The place was basically a former broom closet with a hot plate, but it was a roof over her head. To cover the $275 monthly rent, she took a late-night janitorial job at the city's grimy downtown train station. Natalie worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., mopping floors, scrubbing toilets, and emptying trash cans that always seemed to overflow with discarded food wrappers and old porno mags. For the first time in years, she had a stable home base to continue her all-consuming hunt for Peter. The dank little apartment was her sanctum, the walls covered with maps, notes, pictures, and records detailing her decade-long quest. Working the overnight hours left Natalie's days free to scour public records and government officials, follow any tenuous lead in her all-consuming quest to find her long-lost brother. 6 months into her newfound life of semi-stability, she met Roman. The charming, handsome older man, with a thick Brooklyn accent and slick pomaded hair, seemed to be the answer to her prayers. Natalie was immediately smitten by his smooth charms and promises to use his wealth and underworld connections to locate Peter if she would agree to be his wife. The desperate young woman eagerly signed the official-looking paperwork he claimed would make her his spouse and partner in his business ventures. But it was all an elaborate ruse by the silver-tongued con man. Mere days after the sham ceremony held in Roman's rundown apartment, he vanished without a trace, along with the documents that turned out to be papers transferring ownership of Natalie's humble flat over to him. She was left with nothing but a broken heart, the memory of his fervent kisses and whispered endearments, now laid bare as more lies. Natalie also owed a staggering $10,000 debt to Roman's business partners, hulking brutes who took pleasure in smacking her around when the payments were missed. Devastated by Roman's ultimate betrayal, her life and quest in ruins, Natalie spent another 2 years in and out of psychiatric care and homeless shelters. Her anguish over losing everything, combined with her inability to speak the truth about Roman's con to the authorities, only furthered her mental anguish and despair. After hitting rock bottom from the Roman fiasco, an utterly broke and hopeless Natalie was on the verge of living permanently on the streets. Her funds depleted, her self-confidence shattered. She very likely would have drunk herself into an early grave. But Betty, now retired from St. Dymphna's, but still Natalie's dearest friend and advocate, helped secure her a janitorial job at the downtown City Limits Diner. It was a literal hole-in-the-wall greasy spoon with a battered aluminum exterior and an interior straight out of the 1970s. But it was a lifeline for Natalie. The no-nonsense owner, Sam Delaney, was a gruff Korean War vet who didn't care that the new hire was mute. After reviewing Betty's recommendation letter detailing Natalie's troubled past, Sam figured if she was willing to work hard for an honest buck, that's all that mattered. He had one strict rule that employees could take home any excess food from the kitchen at the end of each shift, a policy that may have saved Natalie's life. Working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., she would make her way through the diner, mopping up spilled milkshakes and wiping down sticky tabletops. Natalie would gratefully take home whatever unsold burgers, fries, pancakes, or slices of stale pie were left over each night. It was sustenance, at least, as she tried to rebuild her life. For 2 years, she found a simple routine of mopping floors, with her days spent writing letters, never abandoning her mission to find Peter. It was a typical rowdy Friday night when the drunken lout started heckling Natalie as she tried to clean around his feet. The burly, bearded man sloshed what remained of his whiskey sour onto the cracked linoleum floor. "Hey, dummy! Can't you hear me?" he slurred in her direction, throwing a balled-up napkin that bounced off the back of her head. Natalie tensed, fighting back tears as she instantly regretted taking this demeaning job just to get by. But as the lout grabbed her arm in a vice-like grip, peering into her eyes with a mix of confusion and dawning realization, his bloated, hostile expression quickly melted into one of shocked disbelief. "Oh my God, Natalie! Natalie, it's me, it's Paul, your brother!" he exclaimed, pulling the stunned woman into a crushing hug as tears streamed down both their faces. In that moment, the years melted away, and they were just two lost kids again, trying to make sense of the cruel world. Paul broke the embrace just long enough to drink in her features, tenderly brushing away the tear streaks from her gaunt cheeks. "You're alive! I've been looking for you for 15 years, sis. 15 long years thinking I'd never see you again," Paul choked out, fresh tears spilling down his whiskered cheeks. Natalie simply stared back at her long-lost brother in stunned disbelief, her eyes widening as flashes of their tattered childhood flickered through her mind. This hulking, rough-looking man with the jagged scar on his cheek was unmistakably the same sweet-faced little boy who used to trail her everywhere, clinging to her hand. No words could escape her lips, but the depth of emotion in her gaze spoke volumes to Paul. His baby sister, his best friend and only family he had left in the world, was here, alive and standing right before his eyes after all these years. Natalie reached out a trembling hand to caress Paul's face, to confirm this wasn't another cruel delusion. Her jaw went slack as her fingers traced the planes of his weathered features, taking in all the changes that a hard life had wrought. The tender reunion was interrupted by a harsh voice. "Hey, either order another drink or take your drunk ass out of my diner," Sam barked from behind the counter. The pair quickly disentangled, Paul shooting Sam an apologetic look before gesturing to his sister. "Sorry, mister. It's just, this is my little sister I ain't seen in over 15 years. Give us a minute?" Sam's perpetual scowl softened just a bit as he watched Natalie drinking in Paul with wonderment. He gave a barely perceptible nod before turning back to his work. Paul and his pretty young fiancée, Christina, raptly digested the horrific stories Natalie had written out overnight while sitting vigil with them in the small park across from the diner. By the flickering light of a rusting garden lamp, Natalie's nimble hands wove a harrowing tale of their childhood being torn apart by cruelty, violence, and bureaucratic apathy. How she had endured the waking nightmare of Peter's disappearance, her descent into depression, the betrayal of the orphanage director's broken vow. She described in gut-wrenching detail her hellish years bouncing between psychiatric facilities, homeless shelters, and menial jobs, never giving up her all-consuming quest to find her beloved little brother. Tears streamed down Christina's cheeks as she read Natalie's accounts of being beaten, starved, and essentially warehoused by the system that was meant to protect her. By the time the first rays of dawn began peeking over the city skyline, Paul's anguished sobbing mingled with Christina's as they finally understood the full extent of the horrors Natalie had survived. His brother instincts, dormant for so long, roared back to life with a vengeance. Pulling Natalie into a fierce embrace, Paul vowed that night to not rest until he had made up for all the years he had missed, for failing her when she needed him most. With Christina's help, They would get Natalie into the best psychiatric care and speech therapy available, no matter what it took. He was determined to hear his sister's voice again after nearly 2 decades of enforced silence. 11 grueling months later of intensive treatment. The City Limits Diner had a surprising new waitress working the breakfast rush. Natalie looked like a different woman from the haunted, hollow-eyed creature who had wandered their dingy halls just a year prior. Her chestnut hair was styled in a gleaming chin-length bob, makeup highlighting her high cheekbones and warm smile. The young woman moved with a renewed confidence, dark circles banished, and eyes sparkling with a rejuvenated zest for life. And most shockingly of all, she carried on an animated conversation with each customer who passed through the diner's doors. Sam stood in the kitchen doorway in his grease-stained apron, beaming with paternal pride at the young woman he had given a second chance. He did a comical double-take as Natalie flashed him a warm, dimpled smile, casually brushing a stray lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. He watched, dumbfounded, as her full lips moved animatedly while taking a departing customer's order. "Natalie, you can talk?" the old man gasped, his craggy face awash with disbelief. In the year she had worked for him, Sam had grown immensely fond of the mute but ever-diligent young woman. He admired her resilience, her determination to build a life for herself, despite the tragedies she had endured. But never in his wildest dreams did he expect to hear her voice. "Sure can, Sammy," she lilted in a honeyed southern drawl, winking at him mischievously. The simple phrase was music to the old-timer's ears after months of communicating with Natalie through pencil and paper. A playful grin danced across her face as she continued. "In fact, I've got a question for you." She leaned in conspiratorially, her peaches and cream complexion flushed with excitement. Sam felt his craggy cheeks turning beet red as he instinctively smoothed down his thinning salt and pepper hair. A question? For me?" he stammered, suddenly feeling like an awkward teenager again. Natalie's grin broadened into a radiant smile. "How'd you like to take me out for dinner tonight? I know this great little Italian place." From the corner booth where he had been watching the tender exchange, Paul grinned from ear to ear as his sister flashed a saucy wink in his direction. His heart was fit to burst with pride and joy at how far Natalie had come. Against all odds, she had found her voice, her family, and maybe even newfound love,